Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week?
As per usual, Gary, I am positively fan-fucking-tastic. It has been a glorious week. I also feel like I just got so much work done this week, which always makes me happy because I hate having like an unclear, an undefined end to all the work that I have to do. But we got ahead of it, and we've some exciting projects coming up in the next while, which we've been hinting at the last while, but they're kind of coming to fruition. But look, we're not here to talk about our business because coaching is pretty much closed. I know you have a few calls booked in, but we're pretty much closed in terms of myself and you having clients. Brian obviously has still got room for clients. If anyone's looking for nutrition coaching, that's available. But how's life with you?
Life is good. This has been my first proper week off of the summer, so I've had a very productive week. We've taken on a couple of new clients, been working on our Coaches Corner content, sharing some new lectures today and tomorrow. So very exciting. Like yourself, it's been nice to put a kind of an end point to work of the week. And, I'm going to take a bit of time off over the weekend, and that's going to be a real luxury.
You're not allowed to do that. I'm not allowing it.
Absolutely will be. I'll be fucking chilling hard, reading books and drinking pre-workout to calm myself down. Great.
Anyway, look, we're here to continue on with our fat loss series. And in this one, we're actually going to talk about like how do you set calories, right? Because this is something that is kind of foundational to fat loss. We've been talking about all this energy balance stuff, all this calories, blah, 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 right? But you need to know how to actually set them. Well, that's not true. You need to know how to manage your food so that you manage your calories, right? But if we're looking at this from the perspective that you want to effectively eat as much as possible while still getting results, it probably behooves you to understand where your calorie requirements are actually at, right? It probably makes sense to go, okay, this is roughly how many calories I should eat if I just wanted to maintain my weight, and this is roughly how many calories I should eat if I want to lose weight, right? Because that actually is a really freeing concept. And a lot of people get very caught up on like, oh, counting calories, it's really bad. I've always had bad experiences with it. And in reality, the reason most people have bad experiences with it is because they try to do it completely wrong. And what I mean by that is they have a mindset going into this in terms of like, how can I eat the least amount of food, right? They'd be like, right, let's set my calories as low as possible and try to stay within that number, right? And that's not the best way to go away about fat loss. Like, yeah, you might get faster fat loss initially, but adherence is usually pretty fucking poor with that method. And psychologically, very few people can go, oh yes, I was eating 2000 calories, let me now stick to this 1200 calorie diet for the next 6 months. It's like, it's not going to happen. Most people are going to fail with that approach. So is there a better approach? Yes there is, right? So how do we actually go about setting our calories, right? So the first thing we have to understand is that like metabolism, it's not a set number. It's not like, oh, this is the exact number. Your metabolism, like, you don't have a number there, go, oh, your metabolic rate is 2200 minus 2500. It is a representation. Like, you can work that out, you can use a calculator online, you can find those numbers, but it's not telling you the whole story because you are an individual. So there's always going to be inaccuracy in these numbers until we have some degree of, or some amount of data that we can pull from and interpret, right? So that kind of brings me to the first thing. It's like, okay, the way most people set up their calories, the way most people go, okay, I want to go on a diet, I want to get my nutrition sorted. What they'll do is they'll Google calorie calculator, something like that. They'll look up something. Maybe they know some names, or like Harris Benedict formula or something, right? They'll find a calorie calculator online, maybe a calorie and macronutrient calculator online, right? And like, we have produced them before. We've made them like in Excel and stuff like that and put them on our website. And like, it's a great starting point, right? No doubt about it. Using that is a great tool, right? However, the unfortunate thing is that most people put a lot of stock in the number that spits out. And in reality, it's a best guess. Like, it's not taking into account all that's going on, especially considering that most people use those calculators incorrectly. And most people go, oh, this has just told me my BMR. That's what I'm going to set my calories at, or that's what I'm going to reduce by 500 calories or whatever, right? Rather than what you want to do on top of that is use like, you know, an activity multiplier, right? People will just be like, no, I'm not going to do that because fuck that. Like, why would I take account of all that other stuff, you know? So we're already off to a bad foot because you say you're using a calculator, but in reality, you're not using that calculator correctly. And there's a saying in, you know, most sciences, it's like junk in, junk out. So if you put junk data into the calculator and you don't like actually use it correctly, you're going to get junk data out the end of it. So you have to there's a skill to using these calculators correctly and interpreting them, you know? So that's the first thing. However, I don't think most people need to do that. You know, it's a great starting point for sure. Like it's great to just be like, all right, let's bang these numbers in. Let's see where I'm at from this calculator. But there is actually a more effective method in my mind, at least, right? And that is the what I call the average and adjust method, right? And to do this method, you basically get the calories that you've been eating for the last 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, however long, you know, track that. Track calories. If you haven't got any data, track calories for the next week, right? And then get all that data and go, okay, this is what I have been roughly eating. You know, let's say it's on average, when you average out to 7 days or however long, you're like, it's 1,700 calories. Just picking numbers out of my ass here. Well, let's say it's 1,700 calories. And then you weigh yourself throughout that time period and you go, oh, I've actually lost 2 kilos in that time period, right? We know that you're in a deficit then. You know, we know that that's not representative of what you were doing because this is what often happens. Like you start tracking calories and then you change your diet as a result. So what you're doing now is not indicative of what you have been doing previously. But that doesn't actually matter too much because we can still use the data that we have from your how your weight has trended this how your weight is trending this week, and then we can kind of reverse engineer things, right? Which we'll kind of come back to that in a second, right? But that's what we do at the start. Let's just go, okay, here, track calories for the next few days. Let's see where that comes out at in terms of the average, because most people don't eat the exact same amount of calories each day. It'll be 2,000 one day, 1,500 the next day, 1,700, whatever, right? It'll be up and down, but we get an average, and that gives us an idea of like, okay, this is a good starting point to be at if, you know, a rate of 2 kilos per week fat loss is what we want. Right now, obviously, there's some water loss, glycogen depletion, etc. So it's probably not 2 kilos of actual fat loss, right? But let's just keep the numbers simple. Let's just keep everything, you know, easy to interpret, right? So we go, okay, so we know roughly how much of a calorie deficit we're in based on that, right? However, the way we coach, at least, well, the majority of the time, like obviously it's going to depend on the individual that comes to us. The majority of the time, we set people at roughly maintenance calories for the first 4 weeks, we'll say, right? And the reason we do that, because I know everyone listens to that and goes, oh, I'm going to skip that step. Fuck that. I'm not getting fat loss. I'm just going to maintain for the next 4 weeks. Not a chance, right? And this is a really big mistake in my eyes, or like I would say our company's eyes, right? And the reason for that is the reason we go to maintenance from the start or in and around, like we're not going to know it, not going to get it spot on. It's not going to be perfect. You know, it might be 200 below, it might be 100 above. In and around maintenance, that's where we're going to go at, right? And then we're going to again assess how the body is changing based on that. The reason we do that for roughly 2 to 4 weeks is we're more concerned about setting things up correctly so that long term we get the results that we want. You know, like I don't want to have a client that comes to me and like, yeah, we get great results. We lose, I don't know, they want to lose fucking 10 kilos of fat, and we get great 2 weeks or 4 weeks of fat loss. They lose 2 kilos, and they're like, yeah, I'm really hyped for this, but the diet is, you know, on shaky settings and it's not going to work for the next 12 weeks, and we're not actually going to achieve our end goal, even though we started out, you know, sprinting from the blocks. It's like, yeah, okay, but then you kind of just shit the bed and, you know, we didn't actually get the end result. I'm more concerned about, okay, let's take it a little bit slower initially so that by the end of this, we actually have achieved the results that you want, right? And why would starting at maintenance make a difference, right? And the reason is, if we start at that maintenance calorie level, right, we can actually build good habits. We can actually build good, healthful habits. You know, it's less about, oh, we need to hit these exact numbers to see a change on the scale. It's like, no, what we're doing is we're hitting these rough numbers, you know, not exacting, but we're getting in and around this calorie level so that you feel fueled for your workouts. You can actually start training hard. You feel great throughout the day. Like you get back into, we'll call it hormone balance. Like you're not constantly starving yourself. You're not like, oh, I haven't had a menstrual cycle in the last 2 years because I've been on and off, up and down yo-yo diets. It's like, no, we actually get stuff back in order. And for a lot of people, 4 weeks is all you need. For some people, it's a little bit longer. It depends on the history. That would obviously be individualized. But 4 weeks, it gets us set up in a good place. Hormonally, it gets us set up in a good place. Like psychologically, it gets us set up in a good place in terms of the habits that we are able to perform. Because everyone tries to engage in new habits while dieting. And they're like, oh, I have to switch out all the foods that I was previously eating. Oh, I have to, engage in more neat. Like I have to count my steps. Oh, I have to do X, Y, Z. And habit formation in terms of like dietary and lifestyle is just harder when you're hungry. There's no two ways about it. You're not going to lay down good habits if you associate those good habits with being more and more hungry. It's like that's no one, like you don't move into pain. Most people move away from pain. So if you're like, oh yeah, I do these new habits and I'm fucking starving the whole time, you're not going to stick to those habits, right? And also, if we start at maintenance, it allows you to build up those good habits in a less stressful environment, because you're not obsessed with the scales. You're not constantly looking at that going like, oh, how much have I lost today? Blah, 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 which we'll come back to in a second, right? But do you agree with that, Gary? Do you think starting at maintenance is a much better approach long term? I actually would even argue it's a much better approach short term, but longer term for a client, like, because obviously, like, we've worked with hundreds of people, probably thousands at this stage. So it's like, I've seen this play out time and time again, but is that the same as your experience?
Yes. And what I would say about that is that it also offers benefits, I think, that are related to the habits, I guess, as you said. But one of the things that I try to do is when a client signs up and I give them initial macronutrient calorie targets that I perceive to be in and around maintenance, what I try to do is let them eat as they normally do for the first 1 to 2 weeks, and then I review what they've eaten. So it can be very tempting as a trainer to, from the get-go, come out of the gate saying, right, I want you to have 3 to 4 servings of protein per day. I want you to have 5 to 12 servings of vegetables per day. I want you to eat four main meals per day. I want them to look like this, that, and the other. And then suddenly it's this massive overhaul of how the person normally eats. So instead of doing that, what I try to do is deliver all the initial guidelines and explain what we're doing, but say to the client, right, what I want you to do for the first 1 to 2 weeks is eat the foods that you normally would. Obviously, you're starting a new plan. You're going to be a bit more health conscious. So let's go ahead and eat as you would, but while aiming for these targets that I've given you. And then what I get to see over that first 1 to 2 week period is, how does this person approach in a eucaloric or maintenance state? How do they approach their food choices? And that then allows me to identify holes such as, right, you're not doing a great job of getting in your protein, you're not doing a great job of getting in fiber, etc., etc. So it means that that initial focus can be a bit more on trying to establish a good baseline diet rather than just the change in the scales. So I think that maintenance can sometimes seem very boring for people because it doesn't seem like there's a purpose. So for me, at least in coaching, if we make it very clear that we actually are trying to assess food quality, how full you are in response to this level of calories and everything initially, I think it makes it clearer the purpose of that actual phase. And that is ultimately what you should be trying to do when you are at maintenance, is to to get some stability going. Because if you have stability, it's much easier thereafter to reduce your calories for the purpose of fat loss, because you'll have built a particular dietary structure, and it might just be a case of, right, I'm going to remove my second snack of the day and I'm going to reduce the carbohydrate portion in meal 3, and that's my deficit achieved. You have to change nothing else because you've got that stability in place first, and that's super helpful.
Yeah, and it's probably the step that most people skip, and it's probably the most important step, because if you do get that baseline structure, you get a good diet foundation. Like literally 4 weeks, it doesn't sound, well, to some people it might sound like, fuck, 4 weeks of not losing fat when they've become obsessed over it. Like, yeah, it can seem like a long time, but 2 to 4 weeks, that's all it really takes. And like you said, I do a similar process in terms of, I'm like, look, let's see how you get on with this. Let's see what you do with the diet. How do you set things up? It's like, oh, you don't eat fish or you don't eat any like, marine derived omega-3s, or you don't eat, again, like fiber or protein or whatever it is. It's like, okay, so we need to work on those things. Or it's like, again, the structure of the diet, it might be very haphazard all over the place. There might be no rhyme and reason. Like one day it's 1,200 calories, the next day it's 2,000. And it's like, okay, so you're probably under fueled on these days. You're probably extra hungry on these days. It's like, let's get more consistency to the diet first and foremost. And like, let's not try to do that while we're in, this massive deficit and like excessively focusing on fat loss. Let's just, again, like you said, get that stability. Let's get a good diet structure. Let's build a robust diet so that, again, you have something to fall back on in the future, which is important, because what we want to have is an exit strategy for the diet, like what are we going to do long term? But we'll come back to that later in the podcast, right? So that initial period, in my mind, I'm like, that's the most important thing. If you can do that right, and you can set things up where you're eating roughly enough calories to maintain your weight, I'm like, that it literally does set you up so well. Because from a training perspective, like what would you prefer to be? Well fueled for your training or under fueled for your training? Most people are going to say well fueled, right? So that has the knock-on effect of, for 4 weeks, we're in a place where not only are you getting the diet sorted, the training on top of that, it's getting into a good place. You're really adapting to that training. You're getting into a good rhythm with that. It's not a case of like you're trying to adapt to this new novel stimulus, like new training methods, whatever it is, and you're in a deficit on top of that. It's like, no, we want to just be at maintenance. We want to get a good structure in place. We want to really, again, find that steady footing. It sets you up for the long term. And again, as I said, I actually think it gets better results in the short term as well, because what often happens is people do that initial 4 weeks, get that nailed down. And then, like you said, when we just go, okay, we want to eat in however much of a deficit after that, it's very easy to be like, okay, I need to adjust here, and that's it. And then all of a sudden, they're just getting fantastic results for the next 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it is on top of that. Whereas the other person who started off and like, oh yeah, I'm just going to hammer calories as low as possible from the off and don't build these good structures, these good whatever. It's like, yeah, they get good results over the first 2 weeks, but then it becomes unbearable and they fall off the wagon, and they come back in 6 weeks time after that, having gained back 5 kilos and they only lost 2 kilos. And it's like, you're on this perpetual yo-yo up and down. It's like this, you're not getting good results in the short term, and you're definitely not getting good results in the long term. So let's try a different approach. Let's get this maintenance set up. Let's just focus on good dietary habits, good dietary practices. And then from there, we can focus on the fat loss. So what's the next step? You're like, okay, look, I'll follow it. I'll do it this time. I'll eat at maintenance, right? I'll do it, right? So you do that. You calculate your calories, you find out what the number is online. You're like, okay, that's what the calculator is telling me. But then you use the average and adjust method, and you track your calories for a few days. You get the average, you see how your weight is trending, right? How do you actually interpret that data, right? Because obviously that's pretty important. Like, how do you know when you're at maintenance, right? And the way we kind of can do this is we can kind of reverse engineer, we'll call it weight loss. It's not really appropriate, but fat loss is probably more appropriate, but it's very hard, especially initially in a diet, to be like, what's fat loss? What's water weight? What's going on here, right? But let's assume it's fat loss initially, which it rarely is. But if you lose like 1 kilo of fat, if you were to get like just proper 1 kilo of fat, right, that would be 9,000 calories, right? Because 1 gram of fat is 9 calories, right? So there's 1,000 grams in 1,000 or a kilo, right? So it's like, that's pretty obvious. However, that's not the way it is in the body per se. It's not like you're going to lose 1 kilo of actual fat, because there are other support structures along with that. There's also water, there's other stuff, right? So a general number or a general range they give out for the if you were to lose a kilo of weight, it's roughly 7,000 to 7,700, right? That's the number that gets thrown around. Now, it's very hard. It depends on the individual. It depends on what type of fat is stored, etc. There's a huge amount of nuance to this, which we don't need to get into, because all we need to know is that roughly a range of 7,000 to 9,000 calories is roughly 1 kilo per week, right? So if we want to lose 1 kilo per week, we need to be in a deficit across that week of somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 9,000 calories, right? So you can kind of reverse engineer that and go, right, I lost 1 kilo per week or I lost 1 kilo of weight this week, and let's assume it was actual fat, right? That means, well, choose the lower end, 7,000. It's an easier number to deal with. That means that you were in roughly 1,000 calorie deficit per day, right? So that's where it's at, right? So you can use that information and you go, okay, so that means that my maintenance is roughly whatever number. Let's say you were eating, again, let's make the numbers easy, 2,000 calories each day, and you lost a kilo per week. You can be like, okay, that means I'm in roughly 1,000 calorie deficit each day. That means my maintenance calories are roughly 3,000, right? Now, that's an ideal world. That's a like, yeah, okay, cool. All the numbers make sense. Everything's perfect. We don't have to account for water weight. We don't have to account for X, Y, and Z. Unfortunately, that's not the way the world works. There's a lot more that goes into this, right? Especially considering that most of your days are probably not the exact same. There's differences in muscle glycogen, differences in, food in your digestive system, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge amount of nuance, right? But we can still use those numbers to give us a rough and ready number, right? We then go back and go, okay, so if this is our maintenance and you lost this much or gained this much or didn't move, whatever, we have some sort of guide of like, okay, so this is how the body is trending when we eat this amount of calories. Then we know roughly where maintenance is based on that, right? And again, that sounds a little bit complicated because you're like, oh, fuck, there's numbers around here. He's throwing, whatever. But it's not that hard, right? It's basically like, okay, you want to monitor your weight, and you go, did I lose weight this week on these calories? If you did lose weight this week, how much weight did you lose? Oh, it was half a kilo, or it was however much. You can be like, okay, if 1 kilo is 1,000, or if 1 kilo is 7,000, then you can again do the maths. Pretty straightforward in terms of converting however much you lost. It's just basic maths. You should be able to do that. Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
No, other than moving on to, I guess, the actual rates that we recommend, which I presume is next.
Yeah. So the next thing then is like, right, cool. You've got that. You've got an idea of where maintenance is. What do we do then from that? How do we actually interpret like, okay, where should I go? Let's assume again, we do that 4 weeks. You get a lot of data generated in terms of, okay, I know I'm eating whatever, 2,000 calories, 3,000 calories, whatever it is, right? And you're like, I'm eating that and my weight is staying in and around. There's daily fluctuations up and down, blah, blah, blah. But you're in and around, right? You've built up some really good food habits. You've built up some really good lifestyle habits, etc. Right? So we're off to a good start, but now you're ready to rock and roll. You want to get the fat loss underway, right? So how do we actually lose fat? Like, where do we go from there? So, Gary, I come to you. I know my maintenance now, right? I've done that 4 weeks. What's the next step? How much should I be losing per week? How fast should I be losing? And ultimately, again, because we're talking about the diet, how do I then change the diet to elicit that?
Yeah. So ultimately, what we're looking for in terms of ranges is on average. So, I mean, over the course of a couple of weeks, this is what your average rate would be. What you're looking for is a rate of somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5 maybe percent of body weight per week. 1.5% would be quite aggressive. We wouldn't expect someone to sustain that for a very long period of time. Sometimes people can lose more, 2% body weight per week even. But again, that would be either someone who has very large amounts of body fat to lose, or they're dieting very aggressively for a short period of time. The vast majority of our clients, we put somewhere between 0.5 and 1% body weight per week on average, if we're talking about a diet that's at least maybe 8 to 12 weeks in duration. So what that looks like then is, for example, take 80 kilo male losing 1% body weight per week. They're going to be losing 0.8 kilos. Okay. So 800 grams doesn't sound like a lot, but add that up over 10 weeks and you've lost 8 kilos. So it's still a lot of weight, right? So what you do from there then is you roughly think, right, if I need to lose 0.8 kilos per week, roughly what sort of deficit do I need to be in? And based on what Patty said previously, we know we probably want to be in a deficit of somewhere between maybe 5,000 and 7,000 calories per week. Let's just say 5,000 calories per week. So what does that actually mean? That means that you need to be in a deficit across 7 days of somewhere around 700 calories a day. So that's on the higher end of what we would expect. If someone was on the lower end of that, they'd be at about half of that. Okay. So 700 calorie deficit per day, 80 kilo male, assume let's say maintenance is around 3,000 calories. They're going to start eating about 2,300 calories. Now, 700 calorie deficit, as I say, would be a bit more on the aggressive side. Someone losing 1% body weight per week, every week consistently, would be quite a significant rate of weight loss. And to be honest, we'd also have to consider that within the context of, right, some of this is going to be water weight and other variables as well. Okay. So with all that said, the reverse engineering approach there is fine, but what we typically end up doing is just saying to someone, right, we want to be in a deficit of maybe 10 to 20% of your calorie intake. I think that's the simplest, most practical guideline rather than going back from the percentages and trying to predict all these things. 10 to 20%. So if your maintenance is 3,000, 10% will be a fairly subtle deficit of 300 calories. 20%, a little bit more on the aggressive side, but still not very much, 600 calorie deficit. That scales nicely then with your actual caloric intake. So if you're eating, let's say, 1,400 calories as your maintenance, then it would be silly for us to have specific numbers. Like you hear some people say, just, oh yeah, use a 500 calorie deficit. But 500 calories at 1,400 is very significant compared to 500 calories at 3,000. So what you'd be doing in that case is, again, 10 to 20% deficit per week, 1,400 calories. You'd be looking at 140 or 280, or just say 150 to 300 calorie deficit. So effectively, the larger your calories are, or the larger your maintenance calories, the higher your maintenance calories, the greater the extent of the deficit on an absolute basis in terms of the number of calories, but similar from a relative perspective. And the thing there as well is that obviously maintenance calories tend to scale with body weight. That's not always the case, obviously, but it does tend to scale with body weight. And therefore, the lighter you are, the less weight you're going to be losing as well, because it's a greater relative proportion of your body weight, and vice versa for those with heavier body weights.
Yeah, like I think it's really easy to get caught up in the numbers in terms of being like, oh, should I be in a 200 calorie, 300, 500, 700, like whatever number. Again, like you do reverse engineering. The only reason we brought that up is because it gives you a good guideline, because you can kind of reverse engineer and go, okay, well, I want to lose 7 kilos, 10 kilos, 20, whatever it is. You can be like, okay, this is roughly the timeline of events that's going to take me if I want to lose 1% body weight per week. I want to be really aggressive with things. This is the timeline that it's going to take, like do it for yourself. Like, again, like right now I weigh about 92 kilos. So if I'm like, right, I want to lose, let's say 7 kilos, I want to get down to 85 kilos, I want to be shredded, right? I'm like, okay, there's 7 kilos that I have to lose. So what's that going to be for me? Because again, at 92, 1% deficit per week, or 1% fat loss rate per week, is roughly, nearly the guts of the kilo, So I'm like, I could get that done a lot quicker, right? Let's say it's going to take me 8 weeks to lose 7 kilos, if I was to go on that kind of more aggressive thing, which is important to understand, because if you are a lighter individual and you still want to lose 7 kilos, it's going to take you longer if you're even at that aggressive rate. Because again, you weigh 70 kilos and you want to lose 7 kilos, it's like 1% per week is like 0.7, right? So it's going to take you like 15 to 16 weeks or so to lose those 7 kilos at that same rate of loss, right? Assuming we use that same 1% from the start. But unfortunately, it also, changes with you. So if you lose 5 kilos and you're no longer, like, you started off at 80 and now you're 75, it's like 1% is from the 75 number. It's not from the 80 number that you previously were, So it's like your fat loss is always going to slow down as you get, lighter, right? And it's always going to be effectively a harder process, a longer process if you are lighter. So it is important to understand. And again, like, you can get caught up in all these numbers, whatever. But I think the most appropriate thing to really understand is that, look, a 10 to 20% deficit, somewhere in that range, right? So it's important that you know where, again, roughly where maintenance calories are. And then if you want to be very aggressive with your diet, 20% is the one that we go for. If you want to be less aggressive, somewhere in that range of 20 to 10%. You can go for a 5% if you want, but it's just painfully slow, so we go 10% deficit, and boom, we'll see fat loss from that. And again, in my experience, it does kind of scale relatively okay for, like, if we go in that kind of 10 to 12% deficit or 10 to 12% reduction, you see roughly 0.5% per week. And if you're in that kind of 20%, you see roughly 1% per week. Now, it's not obviously bang on precise, but it's in and around those numbers, you know? So that's why we like those numbers. 10 to 20% drop from your maintenance calories, right? And we can talk all day about like, oh, should you drop it from carbs or fats or whatever? Ultimately, it doesn't fucking matter. Use your preference to dictate that. Like, there is obviously minimum numbers that you want to hit in terms of like fat and especially protein, but like ultimately, we're talking about calories here. So the two things that I care about most, I'm like, let's get your calories sorted and then let's get your protein intake sorted, right? Once those two things are pretty dialed in, then the rest of the stuff, in my mind, it's like we're just focusing on dietary habits. You know, I don't really care if you're, 20 grams off your carb number or 2 grams off your fat number. Like, it's meaningless as long as we're still hitting those calorie targets that we want and we're hitting our protein target, So that's the way I kind of do it. And obviously it seems it's the same way Gary kind of does it, in terms of, we're like, look, let's go for this kind of 10 to 20% drop in calories. Let's see how we get on with that and move on from there. The one thing that, and we did mention it a few times throughout this, is water weight. Man, it is the most annoying thing ever, right? And this is especially true if you are a woman, right? Because like, we're using these numbers and like, we're basically talking it as if we've just isolated all the variables and we're all just talking about, oh, you lose a kilo per week, we can just be like, that's a kilo of fat, therefore these numbers are all accurate and perfect, right? But the reality of the situation is that there's so many confounding factors that go into what makes up your actual weight. And also, a lot of people get stuck on the scales where they get overly, oh, I need to see this number change or else I'm a fucking terrible person, and I'm not in a great position, I'm not doing stuff right, blah blah blah, right? And they're hurdles that you have to overcome, either yourself or in collaboration with a coach. Like, some of my clients, they don't track their weight. Some of them, they're like, yeah, okay, look, I track my weight and it has no effect on them, right? But the one thing that we need to be aware of is that water weight is a thing. And what I mean by that is, there's two folds to this, right? First of all, like, stuff like inflammation can cause a little bit of water retention. Now, that could be around the digestive system, that could be around the body, it could be fucking anywhere, right? It could even be around the muscles. You train hard in an area, it's like you can have more water fluid retention in those areas. But also, and probably the more important thing for this discussion, is that like stuff like carbs, it does actually have water. When you carbs don't have water, well, they do, but they don't. But when you digest carbs and then you store that glycogen, it's like water is associated with that, and there's roughly 3 grams of water for every gram of carbohydrates you eat, right? So if your diet is quite variable in terms of, if you are basically only hitting your calories and your protein and you're letting the rest of the diet fall where it may, there can be huge swings in your weight, because your carbs can be up one day, down one day. There can be a little bit of inflammation from foods you're not used to. There can also be like more sodium in some foods, causes some more water retention. It can be up and down, right? And then if you are a woman, on top of that, it's like your menstrual cycle is going to play into this, and water retention across your cycle is obviously different. So it's going to be very hard to see these trends, right? And this is why for women, we usually recommend like comparing like week for like week, in terms of, if it's week 1 of your cycle, don't compare that to week 2, 3, or 4 of your cycle. Compare it to week 1 of your next cycle, right? Which means that you have to be more aware of your cycle. And unfortunately, a lot of women, especially ones that come to our coaching process anyway, they're just not aware of their own cycle. Like, I've literally had women that are like, oh, I have a regular menstrual cycle. And then when we look at the data, it's like, your menstrual cycle, 1 week it's 4 weeks, or 1 month it's 4 weeks, the next it's like 6 weeks, the next it's 7. It's like, this is not regular. It's like, yeah, you might regularly experience a period, but it's like, there's no regularity to this, and that obviously is really hard to then look at weight loss, because if you have a cycle that 1 month it's literally 28 days, it's bang on, and then the next it's like 50 days or something. It's like, how are you going to compare like week to like week with that? You don't even know what week you're in, so it's like, it's just very hard to interpret that data if you are a woman. And this is why we just try to look at that overall trend, right? And this is the same for males and females. We just want to see where the trend is going. If the trend line is moving in the right direction, happy days, we're moving in the right direction. And if the trend line is, again, we see these huge swings up and down, and then it's level, it's like, okay, we're not actually moving in the right direction. And what I usually use as a, maybe you don't enter in data into fancy graphs or anything like that, and you're not looking at the trend line over time, what I use is, are we seeing regularly, are we seeing new weight lows? Like, again, presumably fat loss, are we occasionally seeing, like, again, let's say you are 72 kilos and you want to get down to 65? Are we occasionally seeing like a dip into the 69? Are we occasionally seeing a dip into the 68? You might be like half the month you're at 70, but are we occasionally seeing those new numbers, those new lows? Are we seeing that occasionally, right? Because if we are, then we know that we're ticking away at where we want to go, because we're slowly starting to see lower and lower numbers on the scale occasionally. I don't care about the day-to-day variations, because clearly it's fluctuating madly, but as long as we're seeing new lows each time or occasionally, I'm like, look, we're on track with things. But that is something that you're going to have to overcome on every single fat loss diet. Every single individual that has dieted has had to overcome this. And the really infuriating thing about it is that you do have this process where, as you lose fat, like your body kind of holds on to the weight, the kind of set point weight. And like there's various theories as to why this occurs or how it occurs, like mechanistic theories and stuff. I don't really care what they are. Well, I actually care. What I'm like, look, in this practical format, I'm like, I don't care what they are. It is just something that you're going to experience, which is, you might be doing everything right, and then your weight doesn't budge at all, and you might be like, oh, I need to drop calories further again, and go harder with the deficit or whatever. And in reality, it's like, no, like if you just wait like 2 or 3 more days, maybe a week, is like all of a sudden you see the scales drop down again, so it's like, it's very hard when you're coaching yourself, because you don't know when to pull the trigger on different things. You don't have that objective eye on all the data, whereas like a coach obviously does. Do you have anything to say on that, Gary, especially in terms of water weight fluctuating?
I actually don't think so. I think you covered it.
Fantastic. I'm going to just sip my water. So if you have the next point you'd like to talk about, we can get on to it.
Yeah, I suppose just one quick point as well is that, on the topic of water waste, like especially as we move into summer now, it is important to consider how your type of activity, the place you are in the world, the heat, etc. All those types of things can also impact your weight, and people don't often consider it. And this is something I come across every summer with clients, where someone will get sunburned and they'll be inflamed, the natural healing process of healing from sunburn, and generally a bit of water retention that goes along with that. You'll probably notice that if you've ever gotten like burnt on the beach, and next thing you look at your abs and you just kind of feel a little bit softer, like it seems like there's some water retention that goes along with that. And typically you will see a bit of a spike in weight, but it just goes to show that there's so many other variables. Like if you're training and your hydration status is affected, all these different things are going to modify where your weight is on a given day. So again, just focusing on the averages and appreciating that it's not always a result of calories themselves that your weight has changed. That'll help you to make better decisions.
100%. And a general guideline that we generally use is, if your weight is stalled for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, then we can consider a calorie manipulation. So unless it is stalled for 2 or 3 weeks, the calories are staying the same. You're just going to keep engaging in the same habits, that's unfortunately the case, because otherwise what happens is someone sees the weight go up one day, or the scale stall or whatever, and then they're like, right, drop calories by another 10%, and it's like, that's a seriously fast way to fuck up your diet because what happens is you end up eating less and less and less calories, and then you start sticking to your diet less and less and less, which inevitably leads to you eating more and more and more. And what I mean by that is, like, you go, oh yeah, I'll just drop my calories by another 10% and I'll get more fat loss, and like that works Monday to Friday, but then the weekend comes around and all of a sudden you ate 20,000 extra calories over those 3 days, and then you're like, oh fuck, I'll just go back to the same calories I was on, and then it's the next weekend it's 30,000 calories and 40,000 and 50,000. It's like you basically just end up overeating and destroying all the deficit that you had done throughout the week, and basically you've just created this binge restrict cycle where you starve yourself throughout the week and then you binge eat on the weekend, which is something we do not want to set up. Like, that's just not a good beneficial practice, right? So don't chase fat loss like on a weekly basis. Be like, let's have a broader view of this. Let's just stay the course with good dietary habits, And then I suppose kind of the final, well, there's a few little points we want to clarify as well. There's a few things here. once you've adjusted it, let's say you get to a point where you're like, I'm actually really, really happy with my body composition, my level of body fat. I feel like I'm good with, dieting. You should have an exit strategy. You should have a plan in place in terms of what do you actually do next after this, right? And this is why we find it so important to have an idea of where maintenance is at the start, because you know what it's like to eat at maintenance now. You know what it's like to just focus on good eating habits. You know what it's like to just enjoy the diet in terms of, having a good general diet, right? So we don't necessarily go back to that maintenance calories, because your maintenance calories, again, it's a moving target. As we said at the start, you don't just go, oh, I was on 3,000 calories as a maintenance, I'll just go back to that, because your body has changed now. You are lighter. You probably have, increased exercise efficiency, this whole host of adaptations that have gone on, right? So we kind of want to reverse out of that dieting phase. And I don't mean like, we're going to slowly reverse out of it, add 50 calories here or anything. I'm like, no, what we want to do generally is, if you think you're in a 10% deficit, let's increase that by, let's say, 7%, right? Just so we're like, okay, cool. We think due to the adaptations, we'll just drop off a couple 50, 20, 100, whatever calories. It's like, we're going to go up a little bit more, right? We're going to see where maintenance is. Maybe again, like you're in a 10% deficit and you're like, all right, I'm going to go up 7%, and you stay there and you're like, oh no, I'm actually still losing weight. Let's bump calories up again, right? Because we want to get back to maintenance as fast as possible, but we effectively don't want to overshoot that maintenance. We don't want to just go arbitrarily like, oh, I'll just go back up to the maintenance that I previously was at, which is obviously not your maintenance anymore. Or we don't arbitrarily just go, right, oh, I'm just going to add in 500 calories, right? Because what often happens then is you set yourself up to not actually maintain the fat loss. And then you get back into this binge restrict cycle where you do that for 6 weeks. You're like, oh, I'm in maintenance. And then you start seeing fat gain and you're like, oh, fuck this, and going back into a deficit. And then you just keep chasing that back and forth, yo-yo, up and down. It's like, no, we want to set things up better for the long term. Do you have any alterations to that plan, Gary? Do you like to just, do you have any heuristics that you use?
I don't think so. I'm adding very little to this conversation. This is very much our basic everyday bread and butter, but like I do the exact same as you pretty much.
I should hope so. Anyway, right. So the next thing then is, well, I suppose it's actually the first thing. It's like, you should have an idea of like what you're going to eat or how you're going to eat long term. And we should be setting that up throughout the diet phase. Like that would be the kind of ideal goal, right? And that's obviously, you're going to eat at maintenance at some stage and maybe into a surplus. So we want to have a timeline for all of this stuff, right? And what often happens when you kind of think of timelines, especially when you go around the kind of diet culture, well, I suppose it's more bodybuilding culture, because diet culture generally, they're just like, let's eat as few calories as possible. And it's like, this is clearly not good beneficial nutrition habits, right? But you'll come across the process of like diet breaks. And these can be fantastic tools, they can be fantastic tools to ensure that you feel good throughout your diet. And there's two ways you can go about these. You can go about them in terms of, planning them. Let's say you want to diet for 8 weeks, and then you're going to have a week-long diet break, then diet for another 8 weeks, then a week-long diet break, et cetera, right? And that's one way you can go about it, create a timeline for that. That's something that I really like. I really like coaches to understand how to do that. However, there is another way to go about it, and I also like this approach. It just depends on the client. And that approach is like, okay, we're going to take things as they come. There's going to be some weeks where it makes sense to push, and there's going to be some weeks where it makes sense to pull back in terms of, look, you're going to have a few events this week. There's, social occasions coming up that you want to enjoy. You're feeling a bit more fatigued from the diet. You're feeling more tired. Training isn't going as well these days. Maybe you want to deload. And it's like, all right, cool. We're actually just going to add more calories, and we're going to have effectively a diet break this week, so you can proactively plan it, or you can still, I was going to say retroactively, but you're still going to do it ahead of time. You're not just going to eat more and then be like, oh, that was a diet break, but you can kind of be more reactive to the situation that's presented in front of you, for someone that's just new to dieting or dieting correctly, I generally like to plan diet breaks. And the reason for this is it breaks that mentality of like, oh, I just always need to eat less, or I always need to be in a deficit. It makes them realize that oh, this is actually what eating maintenance is, right? Oh, now even though they did it at the start, generally, it's like, oh no, the diet went on for 16 weeks now, and now I'm eating that maintenance. Well, 16 weeks they probably have the results, but 8 weeks, whatever it is, it's like we'll have a diet break planned, so it's like how to eat at maintenance and just enjoy life. It's not a case of you like the only way how to eat or to diet or to focus on your nutrition is, oh, I'm losing weight, because that's also something we don't want to build. We don't want to build a system where it's all based on weight loss, when in reality it's like you want to build a system that's based on making you feel fucking fantastic and fueling your body, right? So we need to have periods of time where we're like really focusing on that, even if the main goal is fat loss, right? So diet breaks can be a phenomenal tool. Do you use them much, Gary, yourself?
Yeah, I do actually. Very much. I would say reactive. Well, it depends. Sometimes I'm proactive with it, where if I know that someone has a holiday or something, it'll be more of a social diet break is what we go with. But sometimes what'll happen is if a client is just reporting increased kind of symptoms of fatigue, like poor recovery from training, maybe motivation is down, I'll often use a diet break in those cases. And it's very much psychological in nature. And I'll typically couple it with trying to reduce training volume, and I'll also instruct the client, even though like it's obviously not my place to guide their whole life, but I'll say please take some time at the weekend or with the time you've made up from your workouts to get a bit of sleep, do some leisure activities that you actually enjoy, take your girlfriend or boyfriend or a friend or whatever, go see a movie, do whatever, go for dinner, because you actually do need to just have those periods of time where you do back off, particularly when motivation starts to drop. And so if dietary adherence is starting to be a bit compromised, I see someone's a bit slow to check in, they're feeling fatigued, they're sleeping poorly, that's when I start to consider bringing in those things.
100%. And as I said, like you can be proactive with it, you can be
Yeah.
reactive with it. Both make sense. It just depends on the person in front of you. And again, this is a hard thing to do yourself. If you're coaching yourself, you're like, oh, should this, like, are you basically just taking the piss with your diet? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, this is just a diet break week. It's like, that's why you binge ate. And like, that's not a diet break, like a diet break is controlled, right? And the final thing is, I always recommend, like, this is what we teach people in the coaches corner. It's like you want to set up a timeline for your client, right? And you want to do this for yourself. As we said earlier on, it's like you don't want to have this open-ended, like, oh, I'm just going to diet for months. Like you don't want to get into that mentality. You want to get into like, okay, what is the long-term plan with all of this? Where do I want to go with food? Where do I want to ultimately have the diet? Where do I ultimately want to have my body, health, physique, everything, right? You want to have a long-term vision, right? And then you can set out a timeline so that you can be like, oh, I have a holiday this week or I have a busy period in work. And like, these make more sense to really push the diet, really look for fat loss here. It doesn't make sense to look for it here. It's like you can set things up more accordingly, right? But what I want to caution against, because I know this is again what happens for most fat loss diets, they end up in this kind of purgatory, right? Or like basically a half pregnant position, right? And what I mean by that is like they're not actually pregnant, but they're not pregnant. They're half pregnant, right? They basically don't fully commit to the process. They don't fully go, oh yeah, I'm actually going to do 8 weeks of dieting. They do 5 days of dieting, 2 days of eating crap at the weekend, up whatever, and they're like, oh, the next week they're like, oh, I fucked it up there. I'll just drop calories a bit more, and then they chase fat loss. And they do 5 days of diet, and then their weekend is fucked up, and then they do 2 weeks of diet, and it's basically up and down. I'm like, don't do that to yourself. It is the worst of all worlds.
Yeah.
Like you're not getting the benefit of getting the results that you want, right? So you're basically starving yourself 5 days per week, not getting the results from that starvation, and then probably fucking hating yourself with a load of guilt, shame, whatever else when you eat like crap on the weekend, not to mention all the digestive upset and inflammation, etc., that you get from that. So it's like, don't do this to yourself, right? If now is not the right time to be dieting, don't diet, right? Focus on good health habits, focus on just good nutrition practices, good training practices, etc., right? So doing that, again, having a timeline and understanding like, oh, this is not an open-ended timeline. I'm not just going to be dieting for the rest of my life. You're like, I'm only dieting for the next 8 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it is. That gives you more impetus to be like, right, I'm actually going to stay on track for these 8 weeks because then I want to be done, And this
Yes.
again comes to the next point where it's like, You want to have an exit strategy. You want to have, what are you going to do after that? Oh, you're going to eat a maintenance. It's like, oh, your diet is actually done. It's finished. You don't need to diet anymore, right? It's done. What's the next step? Oh, I want to eat a maintenance. Oh, I want to eat a healthful diet. Oh, I don't want to actually track calories anymore. So how am I going to transition away from tracking calories? How am I going to go to a more intuitive approach? Blah, blah, blah. You need to have an exit strategy. You need to have a timeline for that. And you have to understand like what's going to happen over the next few months. Do not put yourself in a position where you are half pregnant and you're half pregnant for the rest of your life, where you're like, oh, I basically always am on the diet, but I never actually get results. You know, it's the worst of all worlds. So do not do it to yourself. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say, Gary. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I agree. Just get in, get the work done, and get out. Okay. You're not dieting for life. Get it done with. Simple. That's it, you know. Um, so yeah, I mean, I've nothing else to add. So if you'd like guidance with your diet, your nutrition, your training, getting absolutely ripped out of your mind, we do have some coaching spaces available. If you're interested, just get in touch. You can get in touch below. Our email address is there, info@triagemethod.com. And you can also contact myself, Gary at Skinny Gaz, Paddy at The Real Paddy Farrell, or Brian at Brian O'Hangus on Instagram. You'll find all those links below. If you want to just follow along with our content, of course, follow us on Instagram at Triage Method and follow all our own individual Instagram pages as well. And you'll find a variety of useful information on training, nutrition, and all related topics. And you can also subscribe to our Triage Method newsletter, join the Triage Method community, visit our website, look at all of our archived podcasts that we've done before with ourselves and with guests. And if you'd like to give suggestions as to what we should include on the podcast going forward, of course, you can ask us questions as well. You can submit them below. And if you're a coach yourself looking to support your education, you can join the Coach's Corner, which is our education hub for personal trainers and interested trainees as well, of course.
Fantastic. Anyway, I have nothing else to add. I hope everyone, if you are looking for fat loss, you get the results that you're looking for. If you need guidance on anything, again, you know where we are. You can always reach out. And I hope you all have a fantastic week, month, year, life. Enjoy.
Bye.